COVID was very interesting. Let me start by saying not everybody stopped dating during COVID. So my research about online dating, I feel, is very reflective of what's going on in terms of how people are finding love, romance, also casual dating, sex, all types of intimacy. And I think as we become a much more digitally mediated society, as apps and smartphones are part of our daily life, the ways in which people are navigating intimacy are completely tied to apps at this point. The younger that you are, the more likely you are to be using dating apps or some sort of social media platform to meet others. And so I think as we continue to look at how intimacy is happening in society, we have to continue to look at how dating apps and other forms of digitally mediated communication are a huge part of that. So I guess the answer to that is, why is this so important? Because life is getting more digitally mediated and connected to our phones and our devices, and intimacy and connection is a huge part of how we exist in the world. And so as we continue to evolve in these ways, looking at the ways in which corporations also are monetizing that, and as they're becoming part of how we do intimacy, I think is extremely important. What's interesting is when I first started the research, I was looking at how, I think my big question was, well, how are people finding connection through online spaces, right? That was kind of my original question. And then it became more of a question of, how do people do that successfully? And what kinds of literacies and digital literacies do people need in order to do that well? Those were kind of my starting questions. But by the time I started moving to my book project, it became very clear that what I was super interested in was normativities. And I think part of that is because my big question turned into not what makes people successful, but how are people that are on the margins affected by the ways that the platforms exclude them, or how are platforms made for certain people and not others? And so what I started seeing quite clearly is, well, gender expression, for example, which I think we're starting to see more and more as there's been social movements about recognizing that cisgender is not the only way to express yourself in the world, right? That people are identifying as non-binary or transgender. Well, dating apps are not made for those people. Dating apps were originally designed for whoever the normative body is. So the average person, right? The average person in society is what most dating apps are developed for. So if you are cisgender, you identify as a male or man or woman, then the apps are made for you. When you fill out your profile, you click on man, woman, right? In the last 5 years or so, more and more apps have started moving towards gender inclusivity, adding many more categories like non-binary. Initially, when some of the apps started, I would say, reflecting what was going on in society around realizations and social movements around gender expression being more fluid, what you started seeing is apps just started adding a category of other, right? It would be man, woman, or other. Some of them started adding write-in options. You could see a real interesting trend how Tinder had other and they had a write-in option, and then about 4 years later, all of a sudden, they had a list you could pick from, which I'm sure was populated by user data as people were filling in the other option for years. So you can start seeing the ways in which dating apps are reflecting what's going on in society around language and self-presentation and self-expression. Probably one of the other areas that I'm really interested in, I look at non-normative relationship styles. So I look at people who are non-monogamous and polyamorous. That's another whole area where people are on niche apps. But mainstream apps have started making space for that. So OkCupid was one of the first mainstream apps to add an option for monogamy or non-monogamy in the drop-down in the profile creation, which reflects to me the fact that non-monogamy is becoming more mainstream in parts of the world, but also that, OkCupid is owned by the Match Group. The Match Group owns a large percentage of dating apps on the market. There's some money to be made. There was a recent study by gov.u that said something like 40% of Gen Z and millennials are interested in pursuing or possibly having a non-monogamous relationship. Considering that that group also kind of grew up around hookup culture and casual dating and being more comfortable with transparency, then ethical non-monogamy makes sense that you would see those groups kind of gravitating. So this is a whole dating market. I would add that people who are non-monogamous are people who plan to be dating for life. They're not looking for a soulmate and they're not looking to get off the app. So from a corporate standpoint, it would make sense that the apps would try to find ways to be more inclusive around these non-normative relationship styles. So Bumble, I find to be a really fascinating app. Bumble's mission is to transform dating and to push back against traditional gender norms in dating practices. And it's all about making women empowered by giving them what they call first move privileges, so that women make the first move. And in many ways, one thing that is great about Bumble is they're actually creating a conversation about norms and around gender norms around dating, right? They are saying like, hey, this is what traditional dating has looked like, where, the man asks the woman out, the woman waits to be asked out. And that's all about language, right? That's the ways in which we communicate and kind of start moving towards connection. So on the one hand, there is this move towards trying to empower women. And a lot of people that I interviewed who were using Bumble said that they were interested in the mission and the philosophy of feminism and equality and female empowerment as why they chose the app. However, in my research, what I've also found is a lot of women do not find it empowering because of other things that are going on the app. On the one hand, it is based on a very particular kind of feminism in which it's, girl boss, girl power, but it doesn't really deal with how men are part of this process. So it's not so much around equality, it's about making women more powerful and dominant and possibly then subverting male power, right? So this is not about equality so much as a particular kind of feminism. I would say in many ways that's becoming a bit of an outdated feminism. I wouldn't say that reflects kind of a more modern day feminism that's really trying to look at equality across gender and gender expressions, right? Not just male, a very binary way of looking at men and women. So Bumble is also set up in a very heteronormative framework. The affordance of women making the first move is only in heterosexual pairings. So if I was trying to date a woman and I put that I was a woman on the app, then there's no way for it to know who's going to make the first move. So there is no egalitarianism in this. It still is about just flipping it on its head around heteronormative dating. The other issue that I found with Bumble that I think is especially problematic is the affordance of women making the first move is also under a time clock. So with Bumble, the minute that I match with a man, then I get a boom notification from Bumble and it says, I have 24 hours to reach out and send an opening message. So I have to start the conversation. And the man has to wait until I write and message him. Once I do that, he has 24 hours to respond. If at either time one of us does not message each other, then the app basically disconnects us and unmatches us and closes the chat room altogether. So while the affordance of women making the first move might be very empowering because I now have to say something first, I get to initiate the topic, which from a conversation analysis standpoint, initiating a topic is one way that you may have power, over the conversational floor, but it's not the only way. And if the person doesn't respond, then I have no power. I haven't been able to start a conversation because they've not taken the floor. If somebody chooses to delete the match after I've sent them a message, which a lot of men actually do, because there's a lot of men who also, and women, who use what we call power swiping, which is they swipe right on everybody and then they see who likes them, and then they read the profile after they've been contacted. You've got this issue of you can send an opening message, which is great. You initiate a conversation, but if you are ignored, the person doesn't respond and the match gets timed out and deleted, you've just wasted time and energy and you're like, oh, or they delete you, they delete the match because it turns out they weren't really interested in you, which also speaks to how Bumble markets the app. They market it that you have certainty as a woman that once you've matched that somebody wants to talk to you. So they're mitigating the risk by saying it is safe to open up the conversation and initiate conversation. The risk is minimal. It's not so scary. We've made it so that the technology will protect you from this problem. But the technology doesn't protect you from the problem because people can delete the match or not respond in time. And for a lot of people, they don't respond in time, men or women, because 24 hours is rather quick. And so we can also talk about that's another way in which the corporatization of intimacy is all about getting users engaged and being on their devices all the time, which then becomes very exhausting. And so many of my participants talk about dating fatigue. When you've got apps that are forcing you to get back on your app and engage quickly, or else you'll lose your match, you'll lose the opportunity, then the anticipation is there, and also the anxiety that's produced about being a more productive dater, right? Get on the apps or you're going to lose opportunities. And there's nothing about the time pressure or the time crunch as anywhere in the marketing. The marketing is all about the first move, when in fact, the only place that women have any power in that whole conversational turn-taking structure is at that initial opening. I mean, the reality is the app does a lot of the work. The app is the one who opens the conversation floor. It makes the match. It puts out a time clock to remind you to hurry up. There's visual indications in your match queue that you're running out of time because the yellow around a person's profile is disappearing, and you're getting textual reminders that you're almost out of time, like you have 10 more hours. And so there's all this multimodal semiotic kind of work that's adding this pressure to hurry up. And if you don't, then the app is the one that makes the decision that says basically, I'm unmatching you and I'm closing the door. So there's not a whole lot of places where women are actually doing the work. So affordances are something we think about in terms of how the technology affords us to do certain things and not other things. So sometimes an affordance is a feature of an app, for example, and sometimes it's so integrated into it that you don't see it as a feature, but it might in fact be. So one example with dating apps, especially all the swiping apps, is the geolocation affordance. When you're on a dating app, it tracks where you are. It may ask you a question about like where you're from, but it also recognizes based on where your phone is, where you are. This helps you in your search criteria because one of your questions when you're filling out your profile is, what proximity do you want people? How far, are you willing to travel? Which turns out is actually a big issue for a lot of people in certain parts of the world. Why is this an interesting affordance? Well, for some people, they may live out in the countryside, but there's not a lot of people in the countryside, turns out. When you're in a big city, there's lots of people. So some people will literally go out, for drinks or dinner or whatever in the city, and then they get on their app because then it starts, as they're active, their geolocation tag starts to populate other people's filters and theirs. So this may be one way in which people are kind of, you could say, hacking the system, right, based on their geography. Another thing that people do is they intentionally will set their location if the app allows them to do that. And some apps allow them to do that, usually if you pay for premium service. So Tinder was one of the ones that set this up quite early. And what I heard from a lot of people who I was interviewing was that they would set it up before they went on a trip, right? They were like, well, I'm going for a business trip, to another country. So they would set up the geolocation to say they were in the country they were going to 2 weeks before. And they would write it in their profile. I'll be in London, from this date to this date, looking for people to go have dinner with or to go hike with. So they're setting up dates and basically hacking the affordance of the app. So it looks like they're in London before they're in London so that they have the ability to set up dates. So that would be one example. Another one that I think is a little less obvious, but also is probably one of the more important ones, is photos. Since we moved from desktop dating apps to mobile phone-based apps, the image has become even more important, because when you open up a dating app, what you see usually is the full screen, or a large portion of the screen is the photo. It used to just be a portion, but it's become more and more where the photo is prominent. To be successful at dating, one of the things is you should be really mindful of the types of photos you use. That may mean having good photos versus blurry pictures of yourself, pictures that show your face versus obscuring your face with like sunglasses or ski goggles, hats. So I would call that kind of the visual photographic affordance of the apps as they become much more forward or photo-centered. And so people who are successful have figured out the types of photos they should use. And I will say, I see that older daters have a harder time with this because they don't realize how important the photos are. Many men have a harder time with this, and my theory on this is because men aren't socialized to grow up and take photos of themselves the way women are. Women are kind of taught to pose with each other and to look pretty. So girls growing up take a lot of photos of each other with each other. And so sure enough, by the time they're adults on dating apps, they have a lot of photos in their phone. Whereas when I interview men, they're like, well, I don't have many photos. And it's because they don't take photos of each other. When they're out on a hiking trip or whatever, or having beers with their friends, they're not like, hey, take a picture of me with the beer. But women tend to do that more. So women have more photos to choose from. They've kind of gotten some skills about looking like, and this is about socializing women to look to be, they're valued based on how they look and their beauty. So we see this as an area in which kind of norms and socialization become really important to the affordance of setting up dating profiles and how you do your photos. Quite often, when looking at men's profiles, they will just have a lot of selfies in their car, or in their bathroom in front of the mirror, where they don't have as many pictures that show them in life. One of the things I tell people is like, no, your photos are where people first decide it's kind of like they decide if they even want to look at the rest of your profile. If they're it's kind of like, are people going to read your resume? They've already made a decision just based on the first couple of pictures. So having photos that having the digital literacy to know, and the visual digital literacy to know, okay, I need to have a good selfie shot that shows my full face so people can see my eyes, they can see my smile. They can see my smile, by the way. People that look happier are more inviting. If every picture is you frowning and looking angry, it turns out people think you're an angry person, even though you may not be. Having a full body shot that shows from head to toe kind of what you physically look like become important things. It turns out men are very skeptical of women who only have face shots because they think they're hiding the fact that they're overweight, because we also have an ableist mentality around who we're looking for. Interestingly enough, we are looking for people who we think are models, even if we're not a model, right? Some of the apps now allow you to do a video. Tinder used to have just a 30-second looping video. Hinge has you can upload a video. People can hear you. They can see you in action. A lot of people will say they still need to meet in person to get a chemistry check, right? And part of that is hearing how somebody talks, seeing their mannerisms. Video allows you to do that. What I'm finding is people aren't utilizing those more multimodal audio video types of affordances so much yet. But my inkling is, as more people use it, it will become more of a norm. Also, the pandemic really taught people to gain some literacy around video chat. The fact that the world lived on Zoom during the pandemic, people started becoming more comfortable seeing themselves on camera, learning how to position themselves on camera, recognizing that they shouldn't have a dirty bedroom behind them when they're on their video. And these are things that also translate into how people are presenting themselves in online dating spaces. And I think what we'll see is, as more people become more comfortable with it, more people will use it. COVID was very interesting. Let me start by saying, not everybody stopped dating during COVID. Different parts of the world dealt with COVID very differently. Different cities within, the same state or same country all had different rules. People would be in lockdown in one part of the world, and then in another part of the world, there was no lockdown. I live in the US, so I had friends who were in Florida where there was no lockdown rules, and I was in Washington State, which was extremely locked down. And so people were dealing with it differently based on where they were at regionally. But regardless of where they were at regionally, they were also dealing with their own feelings of safety around being with people. What I thought was fascinating is COVID really brought up the stranger danger issues that people used to have about online dating in general. Like back when it was computer dating or personal ad dating, they were like, oh, they're a stranger. You're going to meet them through the internet? Like there's axe murders. Well, now I think people started really thinking. One of the participants in my study said, well, during COVID, strangers are, well, strange. And I thought, oh yeah, that's right. We really became aware of the fact that we didn't know people, and that when you're online dating, you don't know them. They are strangers to you. So people started really thinking again about the fact that this person on the other side of my app isn't somebody I yet know. And they really started thinking a little bit more carefully. What I thought was also very interesting is, because I also study non-monogamy, is that people who were in polyamorous relationships have always had to think about how they navigate multiple sexual and emotional relationships with multiple people, and talking about transmitting STIs. And so people have always, that were in very large polyamorous networks, were thinking about sexual disease in the way that people started thinking about COVID. People started thinking about COVID pods and COVID bubbles, like I can't see more than these 3 people because of transmission. And so the same types of philosophies that polyamorous people were thinking about in terms of safety, risk, and disease prevention were the same things that I saw that all of a sudden people in the monogamy world were trying to figure out. And polyamorous people were like, I already have a map for who I can't see. Like they'd mapped it out, and they had a little network, and they were like, yep, I can't see this person, they're autoimmune compromised, like we need to keep that person safe from other people. And so we could learn something I thought was quite fascinating. The other thing, I think there were lots of people who just said, like, we're just going to start meeting outdoors, right? We can't meet inside. So lots of people started meeting in public parks, as a first date in the park. But also what was going on at the time that I thought was really fascinating was how many people said, I had one person who said, this pandemic needs to end soon because I cannot go for another hike. I just want to go to a restaurant and eat and drink beer. Like this idea of being active, these active dates that were now becoming the norm, for some people were not a good thing. For other people, they're like, oh, good, I'm going to lose some weight. I'm not spending as much money. So people started really thinking outside of the box about how to date. And so that I thought was really fascinating, that people really started thinking reflectively about what did they really want to do on dates, how could they date, and they started doing that. There was also a huge percentage of people who just said, I'm just not dating during the pandemic. Like, I'm going to focus on me. This is a great time to take a hiatus because nobody expects it. And they didn't feel pressure that they had to be dating anymore. And some of them have decided they don't miss it. I've been really surprised, and I'm going to say this is more older daters versus people in their 20s and 30s are still, especially if they want to have children, they still have that biological clock. That became an issue for the pandemic for people who are right around 30s that were starting to get really nervous, like, oh, I might pass the window of having children if we don't know when this is going to end. So you had different kinds of anxieties. You had younger daters who were worried about missing the window if they wanted to have children. And then you had some older daters who said, I didn't realize I'm just happy hanging out with my friends and doing my own thing, and have decided they could care less to ever date again. And many who just said, I'm done with the apps. Like some of them went, oh, I'm just going to join my local hiking group and just try to get back to meeting in person. So I think what was fascinating about the pandemic is a lot of people got reflective. What was also very interesting is that people's politics around vaccinations and masking became kind of the polarizing topic. Being in the US, politics around right and liberal versus conservative was one of the polarizing topics that people would mention in their dating apps. They would say, oh, when I look at people's profile, if they voted for Trump, I was out, or if they, voted for Biden, they were out. So people would be really evaluative about people by politics. But then when the pandemic happened, their evaluation criteria moved to the politics of whether you were an anti-vaxxer or you got vaccinated, whether or not you wore a mask, or whether that became the new politics, and that became the new vetting strategy. It's kind of interesting how you could say different time periods kind of give us different windows into how people are making decisions and evaluating others based on some kind of value system, right? These are all, and they were really all tied to social values, right? It's not like they, it's not random, right? It was still tied to ideology. Ideology is obviously value systems, belief systems that are held, often considered common sense beliefs by a large group of people. So we can see how majority of apps, and I say majority because niche apps tend to be ones that are dealing with a non-normative belief system in some way. But if we think of the majority of apps, like Tinder's the biggest in the world, it's globally known. So what is kind of the basic ideological frame that we can see? Well, one of them is that heteronormative romantic ideals are the way to go, right? Even though there's options for people to look for same-sex people, when we think about the fact that those apps were originally set up specifically for heterosexual daters, you can see how the ideology was fit for the dominant group. We can also see when we look at the advertising for the apps. So if you go onto the website, or even if you go to download the app, in the app store on your phone, you can see the majority of pictures are male-female couples. Over time, if you look chronologically at the advertising from 10 years ago to now, you may see that now there might be a gay couple in there as well. You'll also see that the average person that is visualized in all the images, even if you just do a Google image search and look up Tinder and kind of look at all the images, you'll see that they tend to be young. So 20s to maybe mid 30s. So again, this fits to our consumerist, who's the big consumer market, people who are out there dating most often, and on dating apps, the largest percentage are going to be in that 18 to 35 range, prior to reproduction, right? They're kind of looking for somebody to have children with. So there's also an assumption that you are ideologically that you're looking for a monogamous relationship with one person, that you're going to get married, you're going to, this is what we call ride the relationship escalator, which is you meet, you go on a date, you become a committed partnership, a committed relationship, you get married, you have children, you buy a house, 2 cars and a dog and a white picket fence, right? And then you live happily ever after till you die. That's ideology in place. And you can look at all the marketing around the dating apps, and you can see that ideal of the romantic love between a heteronormative, cisgender, monogamous couple is able-bodied, young, are part of that. You don't see older daters, you don't see menopausal women, unless you are on the Silver Singles app, that is a niche app for older daters. Even though the largest dating pool is still going to be on Tinder. Most people tend to be on 2 or 3 apps, so if they are non-normative somehow, they might be on a niche app and also be on a main app. What other ideological things? A big one, definitely able-bodied, is another one. You don't see people, in wheelchairs on the images, nor do you see people often having pictures of themselves in ways that show them to be less than able-bodied in their profile pictures. There's an app specifically for people who are disabled. So and recognizing that is a hugely marginalized population when it comes to dating. I tend to use an interdisciplinary approach where I will look at, say, the institutional discourses that are going on. So the marketing, the branding, the websites, the messaging that the corporations are putting out to kind of get a sense of what are they trying to say, who they are and who they're meeting. And then I will look at the app itself and the architecture, and does the architecture of the app in fact do the same thing? So eHarmony is a good example because it's known as the marriage app. People who want serious relationships, you look at the images, it's definitely set up for the monogamous, heterosexual people looking to get married and reproduce and have children and be, as Foucault would call, the productive members of society in this way. And then we could look at the app and we would see that the app really was set up for hetero, cisgender, like sure, the options and the drop down menus and everything in the profile selections, when people are self identifying who they are, means that they look like the group in the pictures. So this is how we can kind of bring these together by looking at both what's being said, how the affordances work, what kinds of options and categories are being used to identify people and kind of create a sense of who people are that are using the app. And then what is the language and the visual imagery or videos or messaging that's put out there about who the users are and who the users are aspiring to be.